Snow was falling in those big, heavy flakes that never come often, the kind that make the world feel slowed down, hushed, almost staged for some secret revelation. I parked my car on the street just around the corner, and for a moment I cut the headlights, sitting there in the dark, staring through the windshield at my parents' house as if it were some stranger's home. I hadn't been back in 6 months, not since I left for my training program in Chicago. Half a year of long nights in the academy, of shooting practice, tactical drills, endless lectures on discipline and leadership, and in between all that, stolen minutes to call home. Every time it was the same. My mom's steady voice, calm, rehearsed even, saying everything's fine, don't worry, focus on your career. And I wanted so badly to believe her, because the alternative, that something might be wrong with Grandma Mary, was a thought I could barely let myself hold. I did what I could from afar. Every weekend I wired money for her care, prescriptions, groceries, heating bills. I pictured her wrapped in warm sweaters, sipping tea, feeling looked after. Mom always told me, "We've got it covered, Nancy, it's enough." Dad would chime in too, short and clipped, "Mary doesn't complain." And that was supposed to soothe me, like those words alone could guarantee her comfort. But something in me always itched with doubt, even as I silenced it and threw myself back into drills and coursework, because it was easier to believe my family was telling me the truth. That night, sitting there in the driver's seat with the engine ticking in the cold, I watched the house glow from behind heavy curtains. I could make out the outline of my dad's shoulders, rigid, commanding, just the way I remembered them, my mom's perfect posture, my brother Brian's careless gestures, my sister Laura's laugh like a bell. Music carried through the glass, faint clinking of glasses, voices rising in celebration. It was Christmas Eve, right on schedule, a holiday performed like theater. But just outside that warm cocoon, on the wooden bench by the front steps, sat my grandmother. She looked so small in the snow, as if the night itself were swallowing her. A thin gray sweater clung to her frail frame, slippers sagging at her feet, her hands folded neatly on her lap, as though she didn't want to disturb anyone, even with her suffering. I saw the faint, desperate tremor of her body trying to generate warmth, and frost had settled like a pale dust on the edges of her scarf. My chest tightened as I realized she wasn't just out there for a minute of fresh air. She had been sitting, waiting, forgotten, while inside, my family toasted each other like everything was perfect. And in that instant, with the snow catching in my breath and the steering wheel cold under my palms, I felt something inside me break, not cleanly, not like a sudden crack, but like an old wound tearing open, a realization that every word I had, believed these past months, was nothing but a practiced lie. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips drained of all color until they looked almost like paper, brittle and lifeless. I whispered, "Grandma," and my breath shot out into the cold night like a broken hiss, sharp and fragile. She turned her head toward me with such painful slowness, like every muscle had frozen stiff, and for a second I thought she might not recognize me. But then her eyes caught mine, and there was this flicker, just a spark, of recognition, and it carried all the old things, joy, tenderness, that unspoken message she had always given me. "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'm fine." It was the same look she'd given me as a girl when my dad barked at me for being stubborn, when my mom fussed over my hair and told me police work wasn't for women. Grandma had always been the one face that didn't judge me, that told me I wasn't wrong for wanting more. Her voice came out thin, no stronger than a thread. "Nancy?" What a surprise! And still, even in that condition, she tried to take care of me first, telling me not to stand out there in the cold, to go inside where it was warm. I pulled my academy jacket off my shoulders without thinking, laying it over her frail frame, and I asked her why she was sitting out here like this. She answered with that stubborn softness of hers, "Fresh air, the house is noisy." I could hear the party inside, glasses clinking, laughter too loud. Fresh air in 20-degree weather, dressed in nothing but a sweater and slippers. That wasn't fresh air. That was survival in disguise. I sat beside her, feeling the icy wood of the bench seep through my clothes, and I wrapped my arms around her, trying to will my body heat into hers, trying to make up for all the months I hadn't been there. Her skin was like glass against my palms, translucent and frighteningly cold. Her teeth chattered so quietly it made my stomach knot, like each tiny sound was a countdown of how much time she had left if I hadn't shown up when I did. Finally, I lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, lighter than the gear bag I carried every day in Chicago, and she leaned into me without resistance, as if her body had been waiting for someone to notice. I carried her up the steps, heart pounding, and reached for the door. The brass handle was slick and frozen under my fingers, and when I twisted it, it held firm. Locked. Of course it was. A warm house knows how to keep its warmth in, and sometimes, cruelly, how to keep people out. I shifted her gently in my arms and knocked 3 times, sharp and measured, the way we were trained, not begging, not pleading, just demanding to be let in. And in that moment, standing there with my grandmother's trembling body against mine, I knew this was more than just a locked door. It was the symbol of everything I had missed, everything they had hidden from me. When the latch finally clicked and the door swung open, I was met with the sight of my mother standing there in a sequined dress, her smile stretched thin and polished, the same smile that had trained me as a child to drop my eyes to the floor. "Nancy," she said, like I was some unexpected guest who'd arrived at the wrong address. For a flicker of a second, I saw shock on her face, maybe even guilt, but it vanished so fast you'd think I imagined it. She smoothed it over with that same, well-practiced calm, and asked why I hadn't called ahead. "We've got company," she added, her eyes darting past me to the frail bundle in my arms, as if my grandmother were just an inconvenient package I'd carried in. I told her plainly that Grandma was cold. My mother's lips twitched into a dismissive laugh. "Oh, don't be dramatic. She loves the fresh air." Fresh air? My grandmother was trembling, her lips blue, her body nearly weightless against me. Fresh air wasn't what she'd been breathing neglect. My mom waved me inside, promising tea was on the stove, as though a cup of chamomile could erase the image of her mother left out in the freezing dark. Then my father appeared at the end of the hallway, his chin raised just enough to signal that he was still the one in control. His voice came low and deliberate, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise above a whisper to strip the value out of anything I said. "It's Christmas, Nancy. Don't start." It was the same tone he used when I was a kid, when my protests were too much, when my choices were wrong simply because they didn't match his picture of obedience. He told me to bring her in, to put her down, to grab a blanket from the dresser like we were discussing a misplaced throw pillow and not a woman's failing body. I stepped across the threshold, and it hit me. The sudden wave of heat from the furnace, the smell of spiced cider and ham, the sound of muffled laughter and clinking silverware. The contrast was so violent I almost couldn't breathe. Grandma let out a deeper sigh in my arms, her chest loosening as the warmth seeped back into her, and it was both relief and heartbreak rolled into one. From the living room, I caught sight of my sister Laura peeking out, her mascaraed lashes glittering under the Christmas lights, wide-eyed like a child who knows she's been caught in something. My brother Brian raised his glass, as if to toss out a joke, but when he saw the jacket wrapped around Grandma's shoulders, the words died in his throat. The music dimmed awkwardly, like the room itself recoiled at the sight of what I carried in. Guests shifted in their seats, conversations trailed off. My mother, still gripping her hostess role, told me sweetly to sit Grandma in the armchair, that she'd bring tea, but my voice came out sharper than I intended, firm enough to slice through the charade, blanket first. And in that moment, the whole house felt split in two, the party's glossy facade on one side, and me standing there, holding the truth they'd all tried so hard to lock outside, and socks. That's what I said next. Just 2 simple words, but my tone didn't leave any room for argument. Half a year in the academy had taught me that control isn't about volume. It's about clarity, about saying something once in a way no one can mistake. My mom froze, lips parting like she might protest, but she read my face and turned on her heel toward the bedroom without another word. I lowered Grandma into the armchair beside the radiator, easing her down like she was made of porcelain. She looked so small there, swallowed by the floral cushions, her body shivering even as the heat pressed against her skin. I sat on the floor in front of her, took her hands into mine, and began rubbing them gently, willing life back into her fingers. Her skin resisted the warmth at first, clinging to its icy stillness the way people sometimes cling to apologies they're not ready to accept. Finally, a faint flush returned, and she whispered in that fragile voice of hers, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't get upset." But I was already upset. I was furious in that quiet, seething way that feels like acid running through your veins. I lifted my eyes and saw my father framed in the doorway. His stance hadn't changed in all these years, hands planted firmly on his hips, jaw set, ready to lay down the law as if this were still his house, his rules, his world. Behind him hovered Laura, her lips pressed tight like she was swallowing guilt, while Brian leaned back, eyes darting anywhere but toward us, feigning detachment. The whole tableau made me feel like I'd stumbled onto a stage where everyone knew their lines, but me. And in my head I heard their voices, echoing from the past 6 months. "Don't worry, Nancy. We've got it handled. Grandma's fine. We'll take care of everything." Each memory landed like a stone in my chest, and now I could see it for what it was. They hadn't been protecting her. They'd been protecting me from the truth, protecting their image, protecting their comfort. And I realized, sitting there rubbing warmth back into the only person who had ever truly defended me, that trust had been the illusion they'd been feeding me all along. I straightened, locked eyes with my mother, just as she reappeared clutching the blanket. My voice came out colder than the wind outside, stripped of every ounce of patience. "Now, Mom, the blanket, and the socks. My father took a step toward me, his voice controlled but sharp. "You could have called. We would have picked you up." As if the real problem here was my lack of courtesy, not the fact that his own mother had been left to freeze outside their perfect Christmas dinner. I told him I'd wanted to surprise them, and I guess in a way I had, though not the kind of surprise he'd ever wanted. Beside me, Grandma was slowly coming back to life, the color seeping back into her cheeks, her gaze sharpening with every passing minute. She licked her lips and looked at me in that way only she could, full of gratitude just for my being there, no need for grand gestures. It was the same look she'd given me years ago when she smuggled me a cookie after one of Dad's tirades, like love was in the quiet acts no one else saw. Laura's voice floated out nervously, her attempt at smoothing things over. "Sit with us, Nancy. We've got ham, pumpkin pie, cookies." And for a second, it disarmed me, because in that word pie, I was slammed back into a childhood memory. Grandma setting aside a secret slice of apple pie just for me, covered with a napkin, whispering, "Don't tell anyone." My brow twitched, the way it always does when I'm caught between tenderness and rage. "We'll eat later," I said firmly, because nothing sweet could disguise the bitterness choking the room. That's when my mother returned, carrying the blanket and socks, like they were props in her performance of the perfect hostess. She draped them over Grandma's shoulders with exaggerated care, and for a moment, if you hadn't known better, you might think she was devoted. But I did know better. While she fussed, I pulled out my phone. The glow lit up my hand as I scrolled through months of bank transfers, every neat round sum I had sent labeled for Grandma's care, for medicine, for heating bills. And yet here she was, trembling in borrowed warmth, while inside the house stood a brand new flat screen, a designer kitchen, a family dressed to the nines. The screen's pale light felt like a spotlight on all of them. I slid the phone back into my pocket, my chest heavy with the weight of all those lies I'd swallowed. Someone must have sensed the shift in me, because the music cut off mid-song. The sudden silence pressed against my ears, the only sound the tick of the old wall clock as its hands crawled toward 9. Every tick was like a drumbeat, counting down to the confrontation none of them could escape anymore. In the dim glow of the living room, the silver tinsel on the Christmas tree shimmered faintly, catching its own reflection in the glass of the china cabinet. Brian drifted back toward the bar, pretending to busy himself with bottles, while Laura froze in the doorway, clutching the frame like she needed something solid to keep her standing. My parents stood rooted in the center of the room, suddenly looking less like hosts and more like people who had remembered, too late, that they bore responsibility. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply laid down the order the way I would at work. Grandma stays here, next to the radiator. I'll make her some tea. After that, we'll talk. I took the blanket from my mother's hesitant hands, settled it around Grandma's shoulders, tucked it under her arms, and smoothed it across her lap. I listened as her breath finally steadied, deeper, calmer, no longer that terrifying stutter of someone fading out. Outside, the snow kept falling thick and slow, muffling the neighborhood into silence. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks cracked weakly, but their fizzing never made it through the heavy glass. It was as though the whole house was listening, waiting for me to decide what would happen next. Grandma tugged weakly at my sleeve, her voice so faint I had to lean in close. "Don't be angry, sweetheart. It's Christmas." I kissed her forehead and whispered back, "It will be Christmas when it's warm again." And I meant it, not warm because of the thermostat, but warm because love was present. Until then, the holiday was nothing more than a hollow performance. I carried myself into the kitchen, switching on the kettle, watching as tiny bubbles formed and raced up the sides of the metal. The whistle hadn't even started yet, but the hum of the water building pressure echoed the noise inside me. Behind me, I heard my father's cough. That pointed, deliberate cough he'd used all my life to reassert himself, to demand the last word without speaking it. But the truth was, that cough no longer carried weight. That power wasn't his anymore. As I stood there staring into the rising steam, memories I had buried began crawling back. The way he used to run our house like a command post, with clipped orders and the expectation of obedience. One raised brow, one heavy word, and the rest of us fell into line as if we were his subordinates, not his family. And I remembered the little girl I once was, the one who always felt out of place, the one told she was too defiant, too different. And in that kitchen, with the kettle groaning toward a boil, I understood something new. Maybe I hadn't been the problem all those years. Maybe I was just the only one willing to see what was broken. My mother, Susan, spent her whole life polishing the surface of things. Perfect hair, polished nails, a dining table that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. To her, the neighbors' opinions mattered more than anything inside those walls. As long as people passing by thought the Walkers were the picture of stability, she could ignore whatever cracks were spreading underneath. Appearance was her religion, and warmth, the real kind, never made it into her sermons. Brian, my brother, was the golden child. He got the new sneakers, the sports camps, the fishing trips with Dad. Every mistake he made was brushed off with that same indulgent smile. Boys will be boys. Laura, my sister, learned early how to read the room, how to charm Mom with the right compliment at the right time. Her reward was pretty dresses and plates of cookies, a steady stream of approval. And me? I was the stubborn one. Every word out of my mouth was labeled as argument, every dream I voiced branded as defiance. My father's favorite line, "You're always pushing where you don't belong." My mother would sigh, smoothing down my hair with that heavy hand of hers, whispering just loud enough for the guests to hear, "This temper of yours isn't becoming, Nancy." But Grandma Mary, she never tried to sand down my edges. She didn't see a problem child. She saw a girl with a spine. I can still picture the nights when I'd crawl into her room, eyes swollen from another lecture, and she'd sit beside me, stroking my hair with those soft, veined hands. She'd murmur, "Remember this, sweetheart. Family isn't the ones who shout the loudest. Family are the ones who stay when it hurts." Then she'd reach into the cabinet and pull out a hidden slice of pie, the one she'd saved just for me. That little act of rebellion, that sweetness tucked under a napkin, became my lifeline. It was proof that I wasn't invisible, that someone thought I was worth a secret kindness. By the time I hit my teens, I couldn't keep my mouth shut anymore. The arguments with my parents came like storms, sudden and fierce, but I stopped shrinking from them. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, Dad shaking his head at me like I was some mistake he couldn't correct, Mom muttering that girls were supposed to carry handbags, not ambition. And me? I was clutching college brochures for law enforcement programs, my hands sweating, but my voice steady. It was in those moments when the air was thick with their disapproval that Grandma's words would echo in me, giving me the courage to keep standing. When I first told my parents I wanted to go into law enforcement, you'd have thought I'd confessed to a crime. My dad's face hardened, and he spat it out like the words tasted sour. Police work is shameful. Not in this family. My mom didn't miss a beat, chiming in with her little laugh. Girls are supposed to carry handbags, not holsters. It was as if my dreams were embarrassing them, like I was dragging mud across the pristine carpet they called their reputation. But Grandma Mary, she didn't argue, didn't scold, didn't try to reshape me into their version of acceptable. She just sighed, the kind of sigh that held years of watching her daughter and son-in-law try to script everyone's lives, and she pushed herself up from her chair. I can still see her shuffling to the china cabinet, pulling out an old tin box she kept hidden behind the good dishes. Inside was her worn little savings book, the kind she'd guarded for decades. She placed it in my hands and said, "This is for your tuition. I don't have much, but you're not allowed to turn it down. You have to walk your own path, Nancy." That moment, it still makes my throat tighten, because while my parents were busy worrying about what the neighbors might think, Grandma was the only one who looked me in the eye and said I had the right to choose my life. And I did. I graduated, survived the internship, earned my badge. The first day I buttoned up that uniform, Grandma's hands trembled as she helped pin it straight. Her eyes were wet, shining with pride, like she was the one being honored. My parents? They acted like nothing had happened. At family dinners, Brian would go on about new projects. Laura would twirl in another new dress. And when I tried to share stories from the academy or my first shifts, they cut me off. "We've got our own problems. Don't weigh us down." So I stopped talking. I learned how to swallow my words, how to smile like it didn't hurt. But Grandma never let me disappear. She called almost every night. She'd ask if I'd eaten, how my patrol went, if I was being careful. Her voice was my anchor, even through the static on the line. Years passed, and I adjusted to a life full of challenges, adrenaline, and long hours. But deep down, no matter how tough the job got, her words were always there, steady and certain. Family isn't the ones who talk the loudest. Family are the ones who show up when it's hard. And in those lonely stretches of night, when I drove through quiet streets with only the radio for company, that reminder was what kept me from feeling completely alone. That was why leaving for 6 months of training in Chicago had been so hard. Every wire transfer I sent back home felt like a promise, a whispered note hidden in the memo line. "You're not alone, Grandma. I remember. I'm still with you, even from miles away." Each deposit was my way of staying tethered to her, of easing the guilt of not being there in person. I believed I was giving her warmth, medicine, dignity. I believed my family when they said she was fine. But standing in that kitchen, with laughter spilling from the living room like nothing was wrong, the truth hit me so sharply it made my chest ache. Half a year of trust had brought me nothing but lies. While I sweated through drills and exams, while I told myself she was safe and cared for, my grandmother had been left outside in the cold, trembling on a bench, while they clinked glasses of champagne inside. And right then, the kettle on the stove began to shriek, steam bursting like it had absorbed my anger and couldn't contain it anymore. I pulled it from the burner, poured hot water into a cup, my hand steady but my stomach twisting. In the reflection of the cabinet glass, I caught my father watching me from the doorway. His voice came low, cutting, the way it always had. "You're blowing this out of proportion. It was only a few minutes. Nobody hurt her." As if minimizing pain could erase it. As if ignoring reality could make it disappear. I set the cup down on the counter without looking up, my voice flat. For 6 months I called and asked about her. 6 months you gave me the same answer. "She's fine, don't worry." I finally lifted my eyes and stared at him, my throat tight with betrayal. "Now I see what your fine looks like." He opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of my mother's shoes rustling in the hall silenced him, tension stretching between us like the stillness before a storm breaks. When I walked back into the living room carrying the tea, the mood had shifted. Grandma sat bundled in the blanket, her frame so small it seemed to sink into the chair, steam from the cup waiting on the table. Around her, the party atmosphere had collapsed. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some staring at the floor, some pretending to sip their drinks. The laughter had evaporated, leaving only forced smiles and glances that slid away as soon as they met mine. It was as if the entire room had decided her suffering was too awkward, too disruptive, to truly acknowledge. The silence that followed her confession was thick enough to choke on, like every word hung frozen in the air. I turned slowly toward my parents, my voice low but edged with something that cut deeper than shouting. Do you realize what this means? This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't some harmless oversight. You left her outside for hours, in the freezing cold, without a coat or blanket. Do you understand that's not just cruel? It's dangerous. It's criminal. My mom's face tightened, her hand pressing harder against the little brooch on her chest, as if that shiny piece of jewelry could anchor her, while my dad's jaw clenched, and his eyes flashed with that familiar mix of annoyance and authority, the look that always told me to back down. But I didn't back down, not this time. I could feel the weight of every phone call I'd made over the last 6 months, all the times I asked if Grandma was okay, and every time they'd lied to me. She's fine, don't worry. That was their chorus. And now here was the truth, trembling and broken, sitting in front of me wrapped in a blanket, like a discarded thing they'd pulled back inside for appearances only. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady as I said it again, slower this time so it couldn't be dismissed. This could have killed her. Brian scoffed from the corner, muttering something about bills, about how I had no idea what it cost to keep the house running. Laura shifted uneasily, looking between us like she wanted to disappear into the wall. My father raised his hand just slightly, that gesture he always used before delivering the final word, the one meant to shut everyone up. But I cut through before he could speak, the years of silence behind me boiling over. Number. You don't get the last word this time. What you did has a name. It's called neglect. It's called leaving a vulnerable person in danger. And where I come from, that's not a family matter. That's a crime. The words landed heavy. Guests looked down at their plates or their hands, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others glancing toward the door like they wanted to leave before the fallout came. Even the kids were quiet, watching from the corner of the room with wide, uncertain eyes. And in the middle of it all, Grandma sat bundled, her face pale, but her eyes bright with unshed tears, her fingers squeezing mine faintly, as if to remind me she was still there, still with me, even while the rest of them tried to erase her existence. I straightened, my phone heavy in my pocket, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. I met my father's stare and didn't flinch when his voice dropped into a growl, warning me to let it go, to remember who I was talking to. But his power was gone, stripped away by the sight of his own mother nearly frozen on the front porch. I pulled the phone out and said it clearly, deliberately, so everyone in that room heard. If you won't take responsibility, then someone else will. I'm calling the police. Grandma's voice cut through the room like a knife, soft but merciless. She whispered that she had knocked on the window, that she had begged to be let in, and they pretended not to hear her. They told me I was in the way. The words hit harder than any shout ever could. My mother went pale, clutching her dress at the chest, hissing back, "Why would you say that, Mom? Why embarrass us like this in front of everyone?" I turned on her, my voice steady but sharp as broken glass. "Embarrass you? You embarrassed yourselves the second you locked her out in the cold." My father rose from his chair then, his broad frame casting a shadow across half the dining table, his voice thundering the way it had since I was a child. "Enough. You have no right to tell us how to handle our family. We decide what's proper, not you." His words were meant to shut me down, the same way they always had, but they bounced off me this time. I stepped closer, closing the distance, meeting his glare head-on. "You had 6 months while I was gone. 6 months of my trust, of my money sent to make sure Grandma was warm and cared for. And what did you do with it? You threw parties, you drank champagne, You bought curtains to impress the neighbors while you treated her like trash left on the curb. Brian leapt in, defensive, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. That money went into this house. Bills, repairs, food. You think we're living high and mighty? We've been scraping by too. I spun toward him, my chest tight with rage, and slammed my hand against the table so hard the glasses rattled, silverware clinking like a warning bell. Stop lying, Brian. I've seen the kitchen remodel, the brand new furniture, the flat-screen TV you brag about on Facebook. I've seen the pictures from your beach trip in Florida, the one you said you couldn't afford unless you cut corners. And all of it paid for with the money I sent for her care. The room went still, the guests looking anywhere but at me, their faces taut with discomfort. My father's jaw tightened as if he could silence me with a single look. My mother's lips trembled, but she said nothing, and Brian shifted his weight, eyes darting to the floor. And in that silence I realized for the first time that their power over me wasn't real anymore. It was smoke, and I had just blown it away with the truth. I threw their lies right back at them, my voice cutting through the room like glass breaking. I saw the photos, the summer trip to Florida, the new furniture, the nights out, all of it bought with the money I sent for Grandma's care. The neighbors shifted in their seats, some whispering behind their hands, others just lowering their eyes as if looking away could erase what they'd just heard. My mother flushed crimson, snapping, "This is our family business. You have no right to air it out in front of everyone." But I turned on her, sharper than I'd ever dared before. "No, Mom, this isn't family business. This is criminal neglect. Do you know what it's called to abandon an elderly woman in danger? It's a crime. It's leaving a vulnerable person in peril. And there are laws about that." Grandma flinched, her thin shoulders trembling under the blanket, and her voice cracked as she pleaded, "Nancy, don't. They're still your parents." I knelt down beside her, took her cold hand into mine, and shook my head. "No, Grandma. Real family doesn't leave their own outside like garbage while they sit inside drinking and laughing. Real family doesn't gamble someone's life just to keep up appearances." I felt her squeeze my hand faintly, and it was all the confirmation I needed. My father stepped forward, his face red and tight, every muscle in his jaw straining. "Listen to me," he hissed, his voice low but seething. "If you breathe a word of this outside these walls, forget you ever had a father. It was meant to terrify me, the same way it always had. But I stood tall and met his glare without blinking. And if I stay silent, Dad, I forget I have a conscience." The words hung there like a final verdict, and for the first time I saw him falter, his eyes darting away from mine, the weight of his own threat crumbling. The air in the room grew heavy, every breath taut with anticipation. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, its screen lighting up the room with a cold glow. My mother's voice shook, almost a whisper. "What are you doing?" My hand didn't tremble, my tone didn't waver. "I'm calling," I said simply. "If you won't protect her, then I will." "Let the people who know the difference between family business and a crime handle this," I said, my thumb hovering over the call button. Laura cried out, "Nancy, stop! These are our parents!" Her voice cracked, desperate, like she was begging me to hold on to the illusion. But I shook my head, the words spilling out sharper than I expected. "No, Laura, these aren't parents right now. These are people who left our grandmother to freeze to death." And with that, I pressed the number. The room broke into chaos. Guests shifted uneasily, some rising from the table, coats pulled on quickly as if they couldn't get out fast enough. A few murmured apologies to me under their breath. "We didn't know." "We're sorry," while others couldn't even meet my eyes, their gaze sliding away as though shame were contagious. The holiday glow was gone. The Christmas party had ended with a thud. Through it all, Grandma's voice slipped past the noise, steady and fragile. "Do what you have to, honey. I believe you." That was all I needed. My phone trembled in my hand, but my voice didn't falter when the dispatcher answered. "Yes, I need to report neglect of an elderly woman. She was left outside in dangerous cold for hours." I gave our address, the words sharp and final. My mom gasped, throwing up her hands as if I'd just burned the house down myself. "Nancy, how could you? You'll humiliate us in front of the whole neighborhood." I turned on her, the steel back in my voice. "The only humiliation here is leaving Grandma on a bench while you poured champagne. Everything else is just the truth." My father flushed red, stepping toward me with his jaw set, but before he could spit out another threat, Grandma's whisper cut him down. "Don't you dare." 2 words, and it was like the fight drained out of him, his shoulders collapsing under a weight he couldn't carry anymore. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the front lawn, and the crunch of tires on frozen gravel announced their arrival. Neighbors who had been guests minutes before now lined the windows, whispering through curtains, trading looks as though scandal was something they could taste. The front door opened, and in stepped 2 officers, a man in his 40s, broad and calm, and a younger woman beside him in uniform, her eyes alert. The senior one gave a curt nod, his voice even and official. "Good evening. We received a call," and in that moment, standing with my grandmother's hand in mine, I felt the balance in the room shift. For the first time all night, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. The older officer scanned the room, his presence quiet but commanding. "We got a call." "Who reported it?" he asked, his tone neutral but heavy with authority. I straightened my shoulders and met his eyes. "I did. She's my grandmother, Mary Walker. She was left outside for more than 2 hours in freezing weather. No coat, no supervision." My mother's voice shot up, high-pitched and panicked. "That's not true. She went out on her own. We're not responsible." The officer didn't flinch. He simply said, "We'll sort that out, but first, the priority is her health." The younger officer, a woman not much older than me, crossed the room and crouched down beside Grandma. She spoke gently, her hand light on the blanket I had pulled around her. "Ma'am, we're going to take care of you. Can you tell me how long you were outside?" For a moment I prayed Grandma would soften the truth, that she'd protect them like she always had, but instead, she whispered it so quietly I almost missed it. "Since morning." I tried to come back in, but the door was locked. The words slammed into the room like a thunderclap. Conversations cut off mid-breath, chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably, and the festive decorations suddenly looked grotesque against the truth unraveling in front of them. Grandma's voice wavered as she added, "They laughed, they sang, I knocked on the window." But they pretended not to hear. They said I was in the way. Her hands shook under the blanket, and I squeezed them tighter, grounding her as she laid it bare. The senior officer's brow arched, his pen already scratching across the notepad he carried. "Since morning?" he repeated, his voice sharp now, stripped of patience. His eyes lifted to my parents, the air around him hardening. "That's not negligence, that's life endangerment." The weight of his words pressed into every corner of the room, and for once, my parents had no script, no excuses that could mask what they'd done. My father snapped first, his voice cracking with fury. "Enough with these accusations. She's senile. She doesn't know what she's saying." His words made my stomach twist, but before I could speak, the older officer cut him off, his voice measured but firm. "Watch your language, sir, and understand this. If it's confirmed that funds meant for elder care were misused, that's a separate charge entirely." The room shifted. Even the guests who had lingered fell silent, their eyes darting between my parents and the officers like spectators at a trial. I raised my head, my voice steady. I sent money every single month for Grandma's medicine, for groceries, for heating bills. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb swiping through the history like it was evidence in a courtroom. And instead of care, they bought themselves gadgets, vacations, a brand new kitchen. Brian's face flushed, and he exploded, "That's a lie. You can't prove any of it." His voice cracked, not with conviction, but with desperation. I held up the screen, the glow illuminating my mother's pale face. Line after line appeared, dates, sums, little notes I'd added, for her prescriptions, for utilities, for food. I turned it toward the officers. "Is this enough proof?" They exchanged a look and nodded almost in unison, the kind of silent agreement that carried the weight of authority. In that moment, I knew it wasn't just my word against theirs anymore. The truth had backup. The officer addressed them directly, his tone flat as a gavel striking wood. "Robert Walker, Susan Walker, Brian Walker. You'll need to come with us to give statements." My mother gasped, her hand clutching her chest like the shame itself had pierced her. "How dare you? This is our family, our private business." Her voice cracked, teetering between indignation and panic. I didn't flinch. "Family means taking care of each other," I said, my voice cold and deliberate, "not throwing your own mother out into the cold like trash." Brian's temper flared, his finger jabbing the air at me. "You think you're some savior? You abandoned us for your training. 6 months gone, and now you act like sending a little money makes you a hero?" His words cut, but not the way he hoped. I stood taller, the shame he tried to fling at me falling flat against the truth of what stood before us. Because the only abandonment in that room was theirs. Brian's words cut deep, sharper than I wanted to admit. "You really think this makes you a savior?" My cheeks burned, the heat rising as shame and anger collided inside me. For a moment I wanted to shrink, the way I had so many times before, but I forced myself to hold his stare. My voice was steady, even though it came out quieter than I expected. "You're right, I wasn't here. I missed dinners, I missed nights when Grandma needed me. But I sent what I could, month after month, because I trusted you to do the rest, and you betrayed that trust." Grandma squeezed my hand with surprising strength, her eyes shining. "Don't blame yourself, sweetheart. You're the only one who's ever really cared for me." Her words steadied me in a way nothing else could. Across the room, the officers were finishing their notes, their pens scratching against paper like the final strokes of judgment. One of them looked up, his expression professional but kind. "Do you want to file an official report for elder neglect and misuse of funds?" For a heartbeat, I hesitated. The room felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. My parents stared at me, my father's eyes full of rage, my mother's wide with pleading, Brian's narrowed with hatred. It was a silent chorus of demands and threats, the kind I'd grown up caving to, but then Grandma's whisper brushed against my ear, frail but clear. "It's your choice. Just remember, justice isn't the same as revenge." I drew in a long breath, the kind that clears everything but resolve, and lifted my chin. "Yes," I said firmly, "I want to file the report." My mother gasped like I'd struck her. Brian slammed his fist against the wall, and my father dropped his face into his hands, finally stripped of words. For once, their noise didn't reach me. What mattered was the warmth of Grandma's hand in mine, and the knowledge that maybe for the first time in her life, someone had truly stood up for her. The officers stepped forward, their presence final. "Robert Walker, Susan Walker, Brian Walker, please come with us." The shuffle of movement filled the silence as my parents and brother were escorted toward the door. Outside, the neighbors had gathered like a silent jury, peeking from behind curtains, some filming with their phones, their faces lit by the blue flash of the squad car. The holiday lights still twinkled on the house, but they only made the scene look more surreal, like the end of a show that had gone terribly wrong. That night stripped everything bare. All the polished manners, the carefully rehearsed smiles, the shiny surface my parents had worked so hard to present to the neighbors, it all collapsed under the weight of the truth. I stood beside Grandma, her hand trembling lightly in mine, and for the first time in years, I felt the air was clear, like something toxic had finally been named aloud. From that moment, nothing would ever be the same. The house I grew up in had once felt like a fortress, a place I imagined could keep out the world. But after that evening, I could only see it as a monument to betrayal, 4 walls that hid cruelty behind curtains and chandeliers. I packed Grandma's few things and brought her home with me into my little 2-bedroom apartment. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it was warm, and it was ours. Every night I set her cup of tea by the window, made sure her socks were pulled up, listened to her hum while she crocheted. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving family. I was building it. The investigation began almost immediately. Calls from the station, statements to give, forms to sign. It stretched on for weeks, each step peeling back more of the facade my parents had built. The officers gathered the bank records, my saved texts, the neighbors' testimonies. Soon enough, the case was handed over to the prosecutor. It became clear that this wasn't going away quietly. My father and mother would face charges for endangering an elderly person, and Brian, my brother, would have to answer for misusing the funds meant for her care. When the first hearing came, I sat beside Grandma at the long wooden bench, her hand folded over mine like it always had been when I was small. Across from us sat the people who used to tower over me, who used to decide everything with a word or a look. But they weren't the same anymore. My mother was pale, swallowed in a worn coat that didn't match her once flawless image, her fingers trembling as she wrung a tissue. My father hunched, his back bent as if a decade had dropped onto him overnight, his eyes no longer sharp but hollow. Brian sat rigid, his jaw tight, eyes burning with hatred and fear all tangled together. The judge's voice filled the room, steady and merciless, reciting the facts, the wire transfers, the unpaid medical bills, the shopping receipts, the photos from vacations. Each line fell like a hammer, a rhythm of proof no one could escape. When he looked up from the papers, his gaze fixed on my parents. His words cut deeper than anything I could have said. "Do you understand that you placed your mother's life in danger?" My mother broke, her voice cracking into sobs. It was a mistake, but mistakes don't leave someone to freeze on a bench. And in that courtroom, there was no chandelier, no curtain, no neighborly smile to hide behind, only truth, finally standing taller than them all. When the verdict came, it was softer than I expected. Probation, fines, community service. Part of me wanted something harsher, something that would sting the way their neglect had stung Grandma. But then the judge's voice rang out with the part that mattered most. Control over her finances, her medical care. Her life was stripped from them and placed in my hands. From that day forward, I became her legal guardian. For the first time, she wasn't invisible anymore. She had someone officially, permanently, in her corner. We walked out of the courthouse, arm in arm, the cold air biting at our faces. But it felt different than that night months ago when I'd carried her shivering off a bench. This time the cold was just weather, not a threat. She leaned close, her voice faint but steady. "Nancy, forgive them. Don't let your heart grow bitter." I let out a long breath and shook my head softly. "I'm not angry anymore, Grandma. I just don't want them to have power over us ever again." And for the first time, I felt the truth of it. I wasn't carrying rage, I was carrying freedom. A month later, our rhythm was completely different. My small apartment became our sanctuary. I bought her a recliner that fit her frame perfectly, positioned a television by the window so she could knit and watch her favorite old shows without straining. We developed rituals, afternoon walks through the park when the weather allowed, tea with jam in the evenings, laughter spilling out over black and white films she'd loved for decades. She'd pat my hand during the credits and say, "See, I have a home again, a real one, not just walls, but family." Every time she said it, I felt something uncoil in me, something that had been knotted tight since I was a child. The guilt of those months I had been gone, the shame of believing my parents' lies, the heaviness of feeling like I hadn't done enough. All of it began to fade in the warmth of her presence, and as I watched her smile in the glow of the lamp beside her chair, I realized she had been right all along. Family isn't the people who talk the loudest or demand loyalty. It's the ones who sit beside you in the quiet, who keep you warm when the world outside is cold. They tried to reach me afterward. Calls I let ring out, letters that landed in my mailbox with neat handwriting and hollow words. One of them began with, "We've learned our lesson, come back." I stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling between my fingers, before crumpling it and dropping it into the bin. I didn't need their confessions, their performances, their sudden claims of understanding. Family isn't made of words on a page or blood that ties you by chance. Family is built through actions, through presence, through showing up when it matters. That night, as I tucked the blanket gently around Grandma's shoulders, she whispered so softly I almost missed it. "You know, Nancy, I'm happy." Her eyes glistened, but it wasn't the courtroom victory that brought her peace. Not because of the trial, not because of the punishment, but because I have you. Her words broke something open in me, something I'd held shut for so long. For the first time in years, tears slid down my cheeks. Not of guilt, not of anger, but of relief. I knew life ahead wouldn't be simple. There would be bills, appointments, long nights after long shifts. But as I watched her settle into her chair, her breathing calm, her face softened by the lamplight, I understood that we had built something unshakable. A home that wasn't just four walls, but a bond stitched together by choice, by love, by defiance against cruelty. A family not defined by who shared my last name, but by who shared their heart. And in that moment, standing in the quiet of my little apartment, I finally let myself believe it. The truth Grandma had been teaching me all my life. Sometimes the only real family is the one you build anew, protecting the ones who protected you and choosing, every day, to love them fiercely.